Welcome in everyone to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Friday, August 2nd around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about kind of an underrated storyline going into the season. Which of these states is going to have a bigger impact on the college football season, Florida or Texas? Definitely a very interesting conversation that we will unpack in segment 1. Then in segment 2, we will get to all of my playoff predictions. I have a very interesting 12 teams, and I've kind of backed myself into a little bit of a corner with some of the conference predictions I had, but at the end of the day, I'm going to roll with my 12, and at the end of the year, you might be able to make a little bit of fun of me. But at the in the third segment, we will get into my picks for Heisman, Biletnikoff, Doak Walker, all of the big-time awards in the college football season, Joe Moore Award, the best O-line. I'll give out all of mine, and that's a ton of predictions coming for you in segment 3. Then we'll get a little bit of a fall camp update. There are a ton of things happening all across the country. We'll get you updated on Texas, Notre Dame, Alabama, and so many more teams. Then we'll get a little bit up to date on a Friday wrap-up, get all the headlines that we have missed throughout the week, some of the ones that you guys are definitely going to want to know. So we will break all that down at the very end. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show. And the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and I think that's always good for the both of us. Again, that is gsmcpodcast.net. But let's jump right in, and let's talk about this Texas versus Florida battle, because this is one of those kind of underrated storylines going into this season. There's so many different things to focus on in this season that this is one of those that obviously is going to fall a little bit by the wayside. But I do think it's a really interesting question because these are two states that for the last little bit have kind of been a little bit in the dark. You know, Miami not necessarily playing the level of football they've wanted over the last decade or so. Texas in that exact same boat. A&M kind of in that boat as well. So there's been a little bit of a lull in some of these states when it comes to elite college football play. I don't necessarily think that's going to be the case this year. So let's go ahead and jump into this thing and let's start with Florida and break down the Florida Gators to start, because they are a very, very funny team this year, because they're going to be a really good team. I feel very good, confident about that. Now, that won't necessarily manifest itself into a ton of wins. I think 7-5, maybe 8-4 is something that Florida fans could be definitely really, really happy about. But I think it's going to be a really good team. And I think every time someone shows up on Saturday having to play Florida, they can't take it lightly because Florida will beat you. So I do think this is a really good team. Now, they might not be in the top 25 at the end of the year, but they absolutely are a team that is going to have plenty to say on any given Saturday against pretty much anyone that they're playing. Then their big-time rival at the end of the year, Florida State, they have the playoff in mind. There's no two ways about that. They got left out last year. They are trying to leave, no doubt, this year. And I have them going 10-2, I believe, in the ACC, so I don't necessarily think they're going to be this world-beating team, but definitely a team that can get into the playoff. Definitely a team that can sneak in, and we'll get to my predictions in the second segment, but this is a team that has everything at their disposal. There's nothing that Florida State can't do this year. They can absolutely win a national title. They can absolutely have a Heisman winner in DJ. They can do a ton of really cool things, but a lot of things have to come into play, and a lot of things have to kind of work out the way that Seminole fans hope that it does. So this is a really, really good team. Everything is on the table for Florida State, but definitely a couple of things that just have to kind of line up for them to really hit their big-time goals. Miami's kind of in the same boat as Florida State. They absolutely want to go to the playoff. They absolutely want to have something to say once they get to the playoff. So they want to win an ACC title. There's no two ways about that. And if they were able to pull that off, they would be the story of college football. You would have to look no further than Coral Gables, Florida, when you're talking about how big this college football season is, because that is a huge brand and one that has not realized its potential in quite some time. And I think a lot of people think that they might never again, which is a little bit goofy. But on the other side of that, I think some people just don't fully understand the power that Miami can be. It's going to be really real if they hit their ceiling this upcoming year, make it to the playoff as I have them doing. So I do think this is a really dangerous team, and I think they're going to have plenty to say about this upcoming season. UCF is a really, really fun team as well. I think they're a team that is getting a ton of hype as you go into this Big 12 season. As we get closer and closer, it feels like the more and more people start to come around to the UCF way of things. They have tons of talent on that team, led by RJ Harvey, the really talented running back, but KJ Jefferson coming in is absolutely huge. Penny Boone, the exact same. Jarvarius Johnson on the outside at wide receiver. You have Nigel Kelly on the defense. There is a ton of ability on this team, and a lot of it came from the transfer portal. So another team that has to work some kinks out for sure in fall camp, but the ceiling is remarkably high for that team, that is for sure. And then USF is a team that's going to have plenty of effect on this college football season. They absolutely could be your group of 5 representative in the college football playoff. Frankly, if I had it my way and I got to pluck the teams, that's probably who I'd pick, because Byron Brown is one of the most special players in the entire country, regardless of the level that you're playing on, and he's one of those guys that I'd love to see in a playoff type game. So I do think USF could end up being the only Florida team that makes the college football playoff because of some of the paths that the other teams that we just unpacked kind of have. So they could be able to brag at the end of the year, and that would be a huge thing for them. But overall, definitely a team that absolutely will have a ton to say about this college football season. Then you also have teams like FAU, FIU, Florida A&M, all in the FBS from Florida, and none of them are going to be huge factors in their conference necessarily. Tom Herman and the Owls could absolutely make a run in the American, or maybe FIU, they have 11 returning starters, so maybe they make a run in the Conference USA, but overall, none of those teams are really going to have too big of an impact, so not necessarily factoring them in too much into this equation, but if someone does shock me, then they absolutely will be factored in. Moving on to Texas, and we'll start with the Longhorns here. They have title on their mind. There's no doubt about that. Steve Sarkisian shows up to his job every day now and knows that he has his guys in the building, knows that he has a championship roster in that building, and that is invaluable. He knows that everything is the way that he wants it for the first time, probably in his time during while they're at Texas, although a lot of things were in place last year. I think even he would tell you there were a couple of things that he didn't necessarily love about that team. But I do think there's a team that all the preseason hype is there. They absolutely can live up to it, and they absolutely can win a national title this year. But some things have to come into place that weren't necessarily there last year in terms of finishing games, in terms of not taking your foot off the gas pedal, that type of thing. So we'll see how that season develops for Texas, but absolutely a national title contender. Texas A&M is a very interesting team because I think it depends who you ask on what their expectations are this year, because I think there's Aggie fans that would tell you they want to get 8-4 or better. I think there's Aggie fans that would tell you they want to be competing for an SEC title. So there's definitely some wiggle room, I suppose, and it's definitely a team that could go anywhere from, in my opinion, 7-5 to 12-0. This is a very, very interesting team, and definitely one that has a very high ceiling, but it's also a first-year head coach with a quarterback that hasn't necessarily played an entire season of football yet, so you can't necessarily feel overly great about it right this second. But they absolutely are a playoff-level team if everything clicks the way they want, especially Connor Wegman, and frankly, it looks like a really, really fun team to watch. So I do think Texas A&M is going to have plenty to say about the season, although they might not be that national title contender that you think. That could change very quickly, especially in Week 1 against Notre Dame. But SMU is another team in this state, and they absolutely are a team that is going to have a ton to say about the ACC. I absolutely think they do. I believe I have them going 10-2, finishing, I believe, 3rd or 4th in the conference. So this is a very, very good team. They're still adjusting to Power 4 life, so that will obviously be something to kind of watch, and we'll see how they develop into that. I frankly think that physically they're ready to play in the ACC tomorrow, but we'll see what happens. It's obviously a big-time adjustment, but I do think they kind of are a boom or bust team. I'm obviously betting on them, but overall, definitely a team that things could go a little bit sideways in 2024 if they're not careful. TCU and Texas Tech are two teams that, frankly, are sitting a little bit away from a Big 12 title this upcoming year, but as we've all learned, I think, throughout this offseason is the Big 12 can go sideways very fast, and things could get very weird very quickly, and I think particularly Texas Tech, TCU as well, just a little bit, I think are both teams that have the chance to make some noise. I think they do have a ton of talent on that team and a ton of ability, and I think they're going to be able to make the necessary plays. Not necessarily, wow people, make all of the plays in the world, but absolutely be teams that could play spoiler in that conference. And then you got Texas State and UTSA, and these are both teams that absolutely have a chance to be that Group of 5 representative in the playoff. There's no doubt about that. Texas State is second in odds in the Sun Belt, and UTSA is sitting at third odds in the American. So both have a great shot here. They're obviously going to have some things go their way. Texas State has Jordan McLeod coming in from JMU, so a lot of real good talent on that team. GJ Kinney has really been building stuff up over there, and then Jeff Traylor is one of my favorite coaches in the entire country. So I do think this is a very interesting duo, and absolutely one that will have plenty to say in both of their conferences this year. And then you got teams like Baylor. You got Houston, Rice, North Texas, Sam Houston, and UTEP all in the FBS from Texas. So there are a lot more teams, that is for sure. And that's kind of my big-time takeaway here is overall, I think there's awesome teams on both states. There's no two ways about that. Texas, Florida State, Miami, all are looking at a national title as a real option this upcoming season, and especially a conference title is absolutely an option for those guys. But I do think it is one of those things that Texas has more options. They have more teams that can possibly make that magical run into the playoff and definitely make some noise for that state. But when I really get down to it, Florida has the better options. When you look at Miami, Florida State, even Florida, all of those teams can absolutely make some noise. And then you have a team in USF that absolutely can do the exact same. So I do think there is an ability for Florida hypothetically to get two teams into this playoff field. I don't necessarily know who those two will be, but I do think that there's a little bit more of ability on the Florida side of things than the Texas side. I think if you were to get two Texas teams in that playoff, likely one would have to be one of those Group of 5 teams, UTSA or Texas State. So that's obviously an interesting thing to kind of watch throughout the season and kind of an underrated storyline. When you talk about this upcoming college football season, there's so many different things going on in 2024, but this is going to be a really, really fun thing to watch, and I will take Florida to be the more impactful state overall in college football, but Texas absolutely has a ton of teams that can make some noise this year and possibly get two teams into that playoff this upcoming year. But absolutely will be a very interesting thing to watch throughout the year and a ton of teams to keep a tab on there. But let's take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to do playoff predictions. I'll give you my 12 teams. I will give you all my picks and my eventual national champion. This is obviously something that is going to be really hard to pick because you got to put 12 teams in this thing, no longer 4. So definitely a difficult thing to figure out, but I feel pretty good about my 12. So I'll break it down right after this, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing. Sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just broke down kind of an interesting conversation, Texas versus Florida. Which of these states is going to have a bigger stake in this college football season? I tend to lean Florida has better options at their disposal, but Texas has a ton of options, so absolutely someone in there could make a big time run. But let's get into my playoff predictions. We are going to pick the 12 teams that I think are going to make it into the field, the teams that I think are going to be moving on to the Final Four, the championship, and then finally my national champion for this year. Definitely a very difficult thing to do, so spare me just a little bit here, but I will go through all of my picks here, and let's start with the 12 teams that I have getting into the field. I don't need to explain the top 4 teams. Those are the teams that I have winning those conferences, and that's the order that I have them going in, so I don't think I need to explain that too much. Texas, Oregon, and Penn State I all have as 11-win teams in the regular season. They're likely all in. I don't think there's a question there. Now you get to LSU, and that's when kind of the questions start. So I do think LSU is going to win a couple of huge games this year. I am betting on them probably more than I'm betting on pretty much any other team in the country because of some of the questions that they have on the defensive side of the ball, but I do think it's going to be a remarkable team. I think Brian Kelly has learned from last year. I don't think he's going to let another elite offense get in the way of them possibly, or a terrible defense actually getting in the way of them possibly getting to a playoff this upcoming year. So I do have them getting in at 10-2, not necessarily, the most pretty year. I think going to be a little bit up and down, but I do think LSU wins the games that they need to win to get in. I have Virginia Tech as the 9 seed. I do think they get in as an 11-2 team, the loser of the ACC title game. I think this is going to be the story of the year. I think they're going to be the team that everyone looks back on this year and says, that was the one that I was most excited to watch on Saturdays because they were the big-time surprise. They were the Washington or the TCU of this year. Now, there is a little bit of hype around Blacksburg right now, but overall, I don't think there's enough people talking about Virginia Tech as we head into this season. Then I got Ole Miss at 10. I do think this is going to be a team that is going to make the college football playoff this year. They are going to sneak in at 10 and absolutely do something that they've been waiting for quite some time to do. I think Lane Kiffin came over there, and there were a number of things to fix when he came in, and he's done a really, really great job. This is the year that everything kind of falls into place. You have a ton of transfers coming in, a really, really talented team, and I think they do reach that goal and get to the playoff this upcoming year. Florida State, I have getting in, which is the big-time one here, because I have them finishing, I believe, 4th, maybe 3rd in the ACC, but I do have them beating Notre Dame. I do have them beating Florida, and I have them making enough of the out-of-conference to sneak into this thing, and that's kind of a weird thing. It's going to be one of those questions about the 12-team playoff is just how do they handle that? How do they handle different out-of-conference matchups like Notre Dame, Florida State at the end of the year when maybe Florida State didn't play quite as well in conference? So it'll be very, very interesting to watch. Obviously, Florida State, wants to win the ACC and leave no doubt, but I think it'll be a really interesting conversation at the end of the year, but I do have Florida State getting in just slightly over Notre Dame. And then Tulane is my group of 5 representative. When I talk about the American, I think Memphis is the team that everyone points to, and I tend to as well. But at the end of the day, when I look at this Tulane offense, I think they have so many tools at their disposal. They have so many guys that are going to be ready to roll pretty much from day one, and I do think they're going to have an offense that is just going to be remarkably hard to stop. And they get Memphis at the very last game of the year, so you have time to kind of work out some kinks against some slightly lesser teams and then possibly win the American in the last week of the season. You might have to play them again in the American title, but at the end of the day, I do think Tulane finds their way into this. So I have Tulane against Texas. I have LSU against Virginia Tech, Penn State against Mississippi, and Oregon against Florida State. So a ton of really, really fun matchups in that first round. And I do think they're going to go this way. Let's start with Texas. I do think Texas versus Tulane is a very, very fun matchup. I see Austin, being a really, really fun home for a playoff game at some point this year. And I do think Texas just has too many dudes for Tulane to keep up with. I think this is kind of a pretty benign one among this bunch, so I definitely do think Texas is going to win that game. Oregon against Florida State will be a very, very fun one. This is two really awesome programs that are really building into a meeting place that they've wanted to be for quite some time. Both these teams want to compete for a national title this upcoming year, and both teams are building into some really, really special products over the next couple of years, but I do think Oregon's versatility and power on offense is just going to be a little bit too much for them. I think Oregon gets it done and moves on to the next round. I think Penn State faces off against Ole Miss. This one would be in State College, so that obviously would be a huge thing in Penn State's favor, and I think this would be a big-time battle. There's no two ways about that, but when I think about this Ole Miss team, they're going to be able to spread you out and do some things on offense that some Big 10 teams just really aren't going to be able to do. And I think one of the big things here is when you can get that Penn State team spread out on defense, you have way more ability. There's so many guys on that defense that you don't want to face them, 3-on-1. You want to be able to get those one-on-one matchups with some of those elite players that Ole Miss has on the outside, and I do think Ole Miss does enough to win that game. Then you have LSU against Virginia Tech, and I absolutely love this matchup. These are the two teams that I'm kind of buying into this upcoming year, and I do think this would be a very high-scoring affair. Neither of these defenses, I think, would really be able to stop the other's offense, and I think this would be a really, really fun matchup. But overall, I do have LSU winning winning this. Going down to Baton Rouge is just entirely different game than playing at some of the ACC venues that Virginia Tech will have to. So I'll lean towards LSU in that one, and definitely will be a very, very fun matchup one way or the other. But some really, really incredible first-round matchups. I think we're all very excited for those on-campus atmospheres that are coming, but I do have Texas, LSU, Ole Miss, and Oregon moving on to the second round here. But let's get into who I have going to the semis. And Georgia faces off against LSU. I love this matchup. Two high-powered offenses that don't get to face in the regular season. Absolutely want to see them face on this stage. This would be very, very cool. And I do think UGA would just have too many guys. They would have too much to throw at this LSU defense and create some real problems. There's no two ways about that. Anthony, frankly, I just think there's going to be too many pitfalls for Bama. I think there's too many questions on that defensive side of the ball where when you face off against an LSU or a Georgia, I just think they're going to stumble in those games. So I'm not necessarily buying into Bama quite as much. You absolutely could slot them in at the LSU or Ole Miss spot, and I wouldn't necessarily argue with you too much, but I do think LSU and Ole Miss will just sneak a little bit ahead of Bama this upcoming year. Ohio State and Ole Miss will be another really, really fun matchup. There's no two ways about that. You have two teams that absolutely have national title on their mind, and I think Ohio State's just going to be a really, really tough team for Ole Miss to match up with because of some of the continuity, because of some of the talent that they have across the board, and Ole Miss is still fitting a lot of guys into some of the boxes. So I do think Ohio State moves on, finds their way into the semis, and then you have Miami against Oregon, and this one would be so awesome. This one would be maybe my favorite matchup of this entire thing because this one would be an absolute battle. Two transfer quarterbacks coming in to teams that absolutely have national title on their mind, and I do think they are going to be very, very dangerous this upcoming year. I think Oregon comes away with the win. The defense, I think, is going to be really, really solid throughout the year, and they'll be able to hold Miami the way that they want to. And then you have Texas against Kansas State. The Big 12 is still alive. We still get some of these great matchups. Kansas State absolutely wants some revenge for a very, very tough loss in Austin last year against the Longhorns, but overall, I don't necessarily think that they get it. I do think Texas moves on to the semis, and you have the four teams that everyone's talking about going into the year in the semifinal for the playoff this upcoming year. Anthony, I totally understand, and frankly, I've been kind of fighting that battle with myself, if I'm being totally honest. I do think there are going to be a ton of freshmen that are going to have to make plays for them. It sounds like the defensive tackles are coming along a little bit better than they imagined going into the season, but there are definitely some things I'm betting on to be worked out at LSU that frankly aren't right now. So it's a little bit of me kind of betting on this team and betting on this coaching staff in particular, but I do think they're going to make the number of plays. But if you were to argue with me, there's no two ways that I would absolutely be someone that could absolutely buy into LSU not making that run. So definitely could go either way on that one, but let's get into the semis. Georgia against Texas. This would be a very, very fun matchup. We might get it for the third time. In fact, that's what I'm predicting. We get it for the third time in this semifinal, and the depth is elite on both of them. It's going to be an incredible matchup, and regardless of who wins, both these teams are absolutely going to have plenty to say about that national title game, but I do have Texas sneaking this one out. This is kind of my one that I'm throwing into here. I do think Texas is going to be able to get this done and absolutely be the team that kind of shocks the world a little bit and beats that Georgia team, moves on to the national title. Then Ohio State versus Oregon. This is one that absolutely is going to be a really, really interesting team, and absolutely both these games are going to be incredible to watch. But this is another three-peat. This is another game that you'll be seeing for the third time this upcoming year, and frankly, I tried to talk myself out of it in some ways, but at the end of the day, when I looked at these four teams, they're just on a different level going into this season than pretty much everyone else. So I'm leaning towards, this being a little bit chalk at the end of the year and these teams making it to the semis. But I do think there's going to be a number of different things that kind of break down throughout these couple of games, and we'll get a really, really fun matchup. But I do have Ohio State and Texas facing off in the national title. I think Ohio State knocks off Oregon for maybe the second or third time, and they find their way into the national title game against Texas, and this would be a classic. There's no two ways about that. These are two really, really historic classic programs. One has had a number of chances lately in Ohio State, but hasn't been able to break through with Ryan Day, at least over the last decade. Texas has been much longer. It's taken quite some time for Texas to find their way back up to the mountaintop, but I think they're there. I think they're ready to roll, and I think they are a team that is going to be able to make that run that they weren't able to make a year ago in the playoff and find their way into the national title and play a really, really good Ohio State team. But who I have coming out on top, I think Ohio State is just on a different level, guys. It's one of those teams that you go into the season and you're trying to find the issues with it, and it's really hard to find them. Obviously, that quarterback position is going to be a huge one to watch, but frankly, I think Will Howard is going to be really good. I think he's going to be awesome in this in this Chip Kelly offense, and I think he's absolutely going to make the plays that they need him to make. That defense is going to be out of this world, and they're going to win the first 12-team playoff the same way they won the first 4-team playoff. So this would obviously be a very, very interesting story. A little bit, chalk when it comes down to the ratings going into the season, but I just think Ohio State's on a different level, and I think they're coming into the season knowing that they got to win a national title. They got to do a ton of big-time things this year. I do think they do that, and I think Ryan Day gets a little bit of the monkey off its back. No doubt about that. I totally understand not necessarily loving the Texas defense. I think there are a couple of holes there that absolutely need to be filled. It sounds like fall camp is coming along pretty nicely in that respect, but definitely will be an interesting thing to watch. The Ohio State defense, frankly, I think is just ironclad. I think they're going to be absolutely incredible this year. I do understand there's a couple of things that you would worry about, but overall, I think they're just going to be absolutely ridiculous and, frankly, probably be the best defense in the country. But overall, I do have Ohio State winning the national title. I do have them kind of getting that monkey off their back, dealing with all of the Twitter trolls over the last little bit. Being able to get that national title will be absolutely huge for this program. But let's take our second break here, and when we come back, we're going to break down my picks for Heisman, Biletnikoff, Doak Walker, all of the big-time awards at the end of the season, and we will break them all down right after this, so stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about my picks for the 12-team playoff. I do have Ohio State taking home the national title this upcoming year. Also, Anthony, apologize for missing your question up here. I just think Oregon is a little bit more of a complete team, specifically on the defensive side of the ball. I think when you get to that time of year, you're going to have to be rotating a ton of guys in and out of that thing, and I just feel the depth at the defensive line and the back end of that defense for Oregon is just a little bit stronger than Miami. So that's really the big-time reason that I have them kind of winning that game, and it'll be really, really fun to watch that, no doubt about that. There's definitely will be a really, really fun thing. Cam Ward against Miami is going to be very interesting. It's one of those big-time questions. He's walking into an atmosphere that is a little bit different than one he's been playing in before. Frankly, I think this is going to be really, really fun game, very, very close. I don't necessarily think it's going to be all that high scoring, so I don't necessarily think Cam Ward's going to light up the scoreboard, but I think he's going to do plenty, and it'll be a really, really fun game. Haven't necessarily made my final pick on that game yet, but it'll be really fun to watch that one unfold. But let's get into my Heisman pick, my Biletnikoff pick, all of the big-time picks I have for this upcoming season in terms of postseason awards, and there are quite a few to get to, so let's go ahead and jump on in, and let's talk about the offensive side of the ball first. My Biletnikoff winner is Luther Burden. I just think this was the easiest pick of the bunch, frankly. This guy is totally different. There are tons of really awesome receivers around the country, but this guy is absolutely different in every single way. I think he's going to be the top wide receiver taken in the upcoming draft, and I think he will be in Heisman contention at the end of the year, but I do think he takes home the Biletnikoff and leaves college with quite a legacy left behind him at Missouri. I do think the Doak Walker Award winner will be Travion Henderson. this one's a little bit out on the limb. There's no two ways about that. I think Omarion Hampton's going to have plenty to say here as well, but I think TreVeyon Henderson is just going to be different this year. I understand Quinshon Judkins is in that lineup. I understand they're going to have to kind of split snaps from time to time, but I think this guy is going to separate himself. I think he's an absolute beast out of the backfield. I think him and Chip Kelly's offense especially is going to be a really special thing to watch, and I think he's going to be one of those guys that we look back on, some of the other seasons he's had, particularly his freshman season when he came onto the scene and absolutely went crazy pretty much immediately, but I think we're going to figure out this is a very, very special player. There's no two ways about that. Yeah, absolutely. Damian Martinez is another player that absolutely will be in this conversation, and someone that I do think this is going to be probably the biggest battle of the bunch, if I'm being totally honest. There's so many incredible running backs and so many different styles around the country that it'll be interesting to see how they go about kind of choosing this award, but I'm just betting on TreVeyon Henderson. It's a little bit of a guess that, some of the other guys around the country won't necessarily hit their ceiling, but I do think TreVeyon Henderson is just on a different level in some respects. So I'm betting on him. There are a ton of other guys that I could get to that absolutely would have a shot here, but I'll lean on TreVeyon Henderson for the time being. The Joe Moore Award goes to the best O-line in the country. This one's LSU. I feel pretty good about that. I think when you have that duo of tackles that they have, that you can make the argument are both top 3 tackles in the entire country, it's kind of hard to argue with. Will Campbell and Emory Jones are absolutely elite, and then you have Garrett Dellinger, Miles Frazier, DJ Chester, all really talented veteran guys that are absolutely going to move people. Another big-time reason that I'm so high on LSU going into this year is I think they have the quarterback, and I think when he gets to stand back there for quite some time, which he absolutely will be able to do, he's going to be able to dice some people up. At the Maxwell Award, this one's kind of interesting because it's a weird trend that's kind of been happening over the last little bit where the Heisman usually doesn't win the Maxwell. And it's kind of an interesting thing because usually the Heisman is a quarterback and the Maxwell goes to the best quarterback in the country. But I do think Dylan Gabriel will win this one. I think it'll be a battle between him and Carson Beck, but I lean Dylan Gabriel is going to be able to have that explosive offense that a lot of people love at this point in time. So I do think he's going to make the plays that need to be made, and I think I'll lean Dylan Gabriel in this fight. John Mackey Award goes to the best tight end in the country. I'm going to take it to Mitchell Evans. I do think there's a number of guys that are going to have plenty to say here. I think Colston Loveland is absolutely an elite player. Ben Urasek down at Georgia I think is going to have a huge year, but I do think Mitchell Evans just going to get the most targets. I think when you look at that wide receiver room at Notre Dame, it took a big time step forward from last year, but I still think they're going to have to lean on those tight ends just a little bit. So I do think Mitchell Evans will have to make a number of plays this upcoming year for this Notre Dame team, and it'll lend itself to him winning the John Mackey Award and probably moving on as one of the very top tight ends in this upcoming class, right up there with Colston Loveland. But a very, very fun group of offensive awards here, definitely ones that are going to be really, really tough. Anthony, I'm actually about to get to the Broyles Award right now, so let's get into the defense and the coaches. Head Coach of the Year, I'm going Mario Cristobal. I think he's going to make the adjustments that you need to make going into this year. I think he's going to make the big-time coaching decisions that have kind of eluded him in the past, and this is one that I frankly think it's going to be between him and Chris Kleiman, because usually when you look at the Coach of the Year, it's the one that kind of popped that year or made a big time leap that year. So usually a team that made the playoff, or in the new reality, usually a team that wins their conference for the first time in quite some time. I think it'll be a battle between him and Chris Kleiman, but I'll lean Mario Cristobal for the time being. I think he's going to take some big time steps forward and absolutely be someone that deserves this and will make it up there at the very end of the year. So kind of an interesting pick, but I do think Mario Cristobal will be the guy that wins Head Coach of the Year. The Broyles Award, as Anthony was asking about over here, I think it's got Jim Knowles' name written all over it. I think you look at this Ohio State offense, I think they're just elite all over the place. I think they're going to have so many different guys that are going to be able to make plays, and Jim Knowles has been building out this defense for the last couple of years, and I do think they're going to be able to make a ton of plays. Shannon Dawson absolutely will have plenty to say about this award among a ton of other players, but I do think this is going to be the best defense in the country. I think Jim Knowles has built this thing up to a really, really remarkable clip, and I think it's just going to be a really, really hard defense to get any beat on. So I am going to take Jim Knowles. I think Shannon Dawson's an absolutely great pick as well there. I think there's a number of really good picks around the country on the offensive and defensive side of the ball, but I'll go with Jim Knowles and the side of the ball that I think is going to have the biggest effect on the season, which is that Ohio State defense. And then the Jim Thorpe Award, I have Malachi Starks. I think this is going to be a battle between Caleb Downs and Malachi Starks at the end of the day, but when I look at Malachi Starks, he's a little bit more complete at this very moment. I think Caleb Downs has a higher ceiling than him. I've talked about this a number of times, but I do think this is a guy that could lead the entire nation in picks because he's that talented with the ball in the air and absolutely someone that is going to be kind of the general of that back end. He's going to be someone that, frankly, needs to make more plays than Caleb Downs this upcoming year because that back end of Georgia is just not as deep, not as, confident going into the season as that back end at Ohio State. So overall, it's somewhat, the need that they have at that position, but overall, I think this guy is just absolutely elite and will make all of the plays that you need. And then the Nagurski Award, that goes to the top defensive player in the country. I think Harold Perkins is going to make a ton of plays. I'm betting on LSU, as I've said a million times now, but I think he's going to make so many different plays this year, and I think, frankly, the only reason he wasn't as impactful last year was the usage. They put him in some not-so-great spots with that defensive staff, so I do think he's going to be able to be in better spots, rush the passer a little bit more often, and make some of the plays that Tiger fans kind of missed last year a little bit. Absolutely, Ruben Bain will absolutely have something to say. The Outland is one of those that it's kind of hard to get a beat on because they say interior offensive or defensive lineman and then give it to pretty much any defensive or offensive lineman. So it definitely could be an interesting one, but I am going to go Mason Graham there. I think he's someone that is totally just going to bully offensive lines pretty much all year. I think he's an absolutely dominant force, someone that, especially next to someone like Kenneth Grant, is going to have plenty of one-on-one matchups that he's going to be able to exploit, and he's going to be a problem for just about every single team that he faces. Now, there's a ton of big-time defensive linemen that will have plenty to say about this trophy, but when I look across the country, I have the fewest questions about what Mason Graham can do this upcoming season. But let's move on to the big award. Let's move on to the one that everyone is watching, the Heisman Trophy, and I got some interesting picks here, guys, but I do think there's going to be 5 finalists. I think that's something that you'll likely see a little bit more as we get into the 12-team playoff with so many different teams winning their conference or making a run at the playoff. I think there's going to be more players that get a little bit more of that spotlight. So I do think there will be more 5-player kind of finalists in the in NYC going forward. I do think it's going to be Avery Johnson, Dylan Gabriel, Quinn Ewers, Carson Beck, and Cam Ward in New York at the end of the year. I think all these guys are just outright elite. I think they're totally different at the quarterback position. I really wanted to put multiple positions here, but I've seen what the Heisman has become, so I'm not necessarily going to put myself out on a limb and put someone at running back or wide receiver here because it goes to a quarterback. That's just the way that it works. So I definitely think that these are going to be the 5 guys. I think Luther Burden, Garrett Nussmeier, Travion Henderson, Harold Perkins, Kyron Drones are absolutely going to be right there in that conversation among probably a million other guys, but absolutely we'll have a ton of other guys that will be poking and prodding at these guys trying to steal their spot in New York City at the end of the year. But I do have Quinn Ewers taking this thing home. This is a one that, frankly, for the vast majority of the offseason, I did not believe in. I did not think that this offense was going to be at the level that it needed to be. I worried about Quinn Ewers throwing that deep ball at the clip that he needed to, but frankly, everything I'm hearing out of the offseason from Texas has made me feel much more confident in this. And the biggest one for me is Silas Bolden coming in. And this is kind of one that's a little bit interesting because Texas doesn't lack for wide receivers. They got plenty of dudes that he can throw the ball to, but I think this is the difference maker on this team. I think this is the guy that opens so many different doors. He's already gotten comps to guys like Xavier Worthy and Steve Smith in a very short time at Texas, and he's one of those guys that you can get the ball to 10 yards behind the line of scrimmage and he turns it into a 30-yard gain. So I think he has so many different makers. He has like 6 different dudes at the wide receiver position, 3 different tight ends, 3 running backs that are going to get on the field at any given moment. I think this O-line is about as elite as it gets. Cam Williams kind of making his inserting into that lineup as the starter at right tackle, but other than that, everyone else on this offensive line is very experienced and very good, and I think it's going to be one of the most experienced and depth pieces in the entire country. So I do think Quinn Ewers will have plenty of time, and frankly, when he has plenty of time, he picks apart people. I think it's going to be a Mac Jones 2020 type year, but he's going to spread the ball around a little bit more, so there won't be that 2,000-yard receiver to steal the Heisman from him. So overall, I do think Quinn Ewers will win the Heisman. I think it'll be a remarkable year for him that will end in a very, very nice piece of hardware. There's no two ways about that. I do think there's going to be a ton of things going into this year, and frankly, all of these trophies are going to be very, very hotly contested because this is a very, very deep year in college football. There's so many guys at so many different positions. Dark horse for the Biletnikoff, I think Xavier Restrepo actually would fit that, Anthony, if I'm being totally honest. Not as much of a dark horse, but I think there's not enough people talking about Xavier Restrepo right now, so absolutely would be someone that could pop up. I think Isaiah Bond has a shot there. A dark horse, if you really want to get into the weeds, I think Dorian Singer over at Utah could absolutely be someone that has a big-time pop year, leads Utah to a Big 12 title and a playoff, and absolutely can make some plays there. So a very weird year. I think all of those awards are going to be very, very hotly contested and really tough to get a beat on throughout the year, but those are my picks, and I'll stick to them, and at the end of the year, if I'm totally wrong, you're more than welcome to come back here and dunk on me. I feel more than fine saying that, but let's take our third break here, and when we come back, we're going to do a little bit of update on the fall camp. There is a million things happening around the country, but we'll update you on 5 different camps going on around the country and just give you little tidbits that you need to know as we head into this season. So stick around, and we'll be right back with that.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about all of my picks for the postseason awards, including the Heisman. I do have Quinn Ewers taking home the Heisman this upcoming year with a remarkable year in that Steve Sarkisian offense, but let's jump into some fall camp intel. There is a ton of things to break down all around the country. This is absolutely something we'll likely do pretty much every day. We'll likely bounce around a little bit, but this will obviously be a big-time topic of conversation over the next couple of weeks as we head into the 2024 season. But let's go ahead and jump in on in here, and let's start over at Texas, and let's talk about some of the different things going on the defensive side of the ball, particularly that defensive line. There are a ton of questions going into this season. How are you going to replace Tavondre Sweat and Byron Murphy as you head into the season? Well, I think Vernon Broughton is answering that question a lot this in the fall camp thus far. He is someone that has really been very impressive, kind of that leader of that defensive tackle group as of right now. I think that guy right next to him, Alfred Collins, will absolutely be a really good player as well, but it's good that Texas has that one guy. You know, you can look forward and say Vernon Broughton is going to be that big-time space eater, kind of that Tavondre Sweat type player for this team, and they very much need it. And then on the outside, you have Barron Sorrell is absolutely becoming kind of the leader out there, an absolute physical beast, someone that they have so many different edge rushers over at Texas, but he's a very, very good against the run, very, very strong at the point of attack, and absolutely someone that Texas is going to need to play big-time role this upcoming year. Then let's get into Jalen Gilbo. This is the guy that has really been coming along, and he was someone that they really loved last year. He played a number of snaps last year, but got injured, struggled with some stuff, and didn't necessarily come back the same player, but he might just be the starter at the nickel position, and Jahdae Barron might move on over to the boundary corner because this guy is special. Apparently, he's one of those guys that they put one of the helmet communications in his helmet, so someone they have a ton of confidence in. There's no two ways about that. I think he's going to be the starter at the end of the day, and that back end of Texas looks stronger and stronger by every single second. But let's get into this offense, and frankly, the more that you hear about this offense, the more you think they have just ridiculous amounts of weapons. The two new guys to add to that list are Trey Wisner, the guy on your screen, a sophomore running back that is just remarkably fast, and then Juan Davis, a very smooth junior tight end that absolutely has been kind of working on his craft throughout his first couple of years and is finally ready to kind of burst onto the scene over there in Austin. Now, at this point, they have about 7 or 8 wide receivers they can throw to, 3 tight ends, 3 running backs. Sark's got to feel really, really good about that. I think it's going to be a very, very fun year in Austin, and it sounds like Quinn Ewers and really all of the quarterbacks, including Arch Manning and Trey Owens, look really, really sharp throughout camp. So everything's looking right for Texas right about now, but let's move on to Notre Dame. Let's talk about the tackle positions because that is the big-time thing for this team. They're losing Joe Alt. They're losing Blake Frazier at both of the tackle positions, and they're going to have some big guys that are going to have to step up. Charles, I don't want to get this wrong. Jagusa. Yeah, Charles Jagusa is a very, very talented freshman that played in the bowl game last year after Joe Alt moved on to the NFL draft. This is a very talented kid, but he is going into his sophomore year. A big ask for him to take over at the left tackle position for a national title contender, so that's going to be definitely something to watch. It sounds like Tosh Baker and Emil Wagner are battling over that right side, and then Gerby Lambert is absolutely someone that could make some run into that role at some point throughout the season. All very, very talented guys, but again, fairly young, so that's going to be something to really watch here. And then on the outside, Benjamin Morrison is a very talented cornerback for them, likely their best coverage guy on the team. Xavier Watts on the back end is a fantastic player, but obviously being a safety, not quite as good in coverage. Benjamin Morrison held Marvin Harrison Jr. to only 32 yards last season. Well, it sounds like he's out right now with an injury. He's been out for quite some time, but he still hasn't worked his way back. And it sounds like it's going to be relatively close to that A&M game when he finally does come back. And that adds a little bit of a question into that game where you might just need him to play a big-time game against some of those big-time wide receivers at A&M. So it'll be really interesting to watch that develop. If he gets available pretty soon, I feel pretty confident in this team. If he doesn't, then it could be a dangerous start to the season. It sounds like Riley Leonard looks pretty strong early on in fall camp and absolutely will be ready to go week one. He had some injury troubles throughout spring, but it sounds like he'll be ready to roll when week one rolls around. But Alabama is another team that we're watching very closely, a massive camp for this team. So many different things going all over the place with a ton of different changes, but it sounds like that running back room makes them feel really, really good. They have a little bit of continuity there with Robert Gillespie sticking around. You have Justice Haynes, Jamarian Miller back, and both those guys I think are going to be really remarkable this year. Justice Haynes is someone that I think is going to develop into one of those classic Alabama running backs that we all know, and I think they're going to make so much noise this upcoming year. Now, they only rush for about 400 combined yards a year ago, so not necessarily the most productive group coming back for them, but absolutely a duo that can make some noise there. And then you have a group that I'm really fascinated to watch. Obviously, you talk about Jalen Milroe. I've talked about this a number of times. I think he's the most impactful player in the entire conference when you look at the SEC, and could be a guy that definitely makes some noise this upcoming year. And then a little side note, Kane Womack wearing an entire full sweatsuit to practice is an total defensive coordinator move, and I absolutely love that. He's sweating through everything, but that's obviously going to be an interesting thing to watch. That camp is probably one of the most impactful across the country. And then you go over to Florida State, and it sounds like DJU looks really confident in this offense. There have been some kind of wavering reports throughout the days, which is frankly what I was worried about, which is, the inconsistency that he's played with over the last couple of years. I think there's that top-end ability that is really, really talented. There is that ability that he can open up an offense and do some really remarkable things. He showed it a couple of times throughout his career, but I think when you look at, the big-time thing for him, it's doing that consistently, doing that on a week-to-week basis, and from what we heard from fall camp, it's not necessarily a finished product at this point. He started really hot. It sounded like yesterday was a very rough day for him and overall the offense in general. So it's definitely one of those things that we'll be watching throughout fall camp. The other thing that is really interesting with this team is Malik Benson is making some run really, really quickly. He's becoming the top wide receiver on this roster, and they kind of need him to be. I think Hakeem Williams is absolutely going to be a really good player for them, but I think this dude is going to be their go-to guy, and frankly, he kind of needs to be for DJ to be successful this upcoming year. That's why they brought him in from Alabama. And then you look at the O-line and running backs, they look really solid this upcoming year. So if DJ isn't quite as solid as you want him to be, you can lean on Roydell Williams, you can lean on Keziah Holmes, and you can make some of those plays on the ground that you might not be able to make through the air. And then the defense looks about as dominant as you would expect if you're a Florida State fan. Patrick Payton is showing off his elite ability throughout camp, and no one needed him to show that, but he's going to show it all the same. He's a very talented player and absolutely someone that will have plenty to say about this upcoming season for Florida State. And then Ohio State is a very interesting team. They only started camp yesterday, so not necessarily a ton to unpack here, but there's a little bit, that's for sure. The quarterback position is the one that everyone's watching. It sounds like Devin Brown started the camp first with the first-team offense out there at quarterback. They did split some of those snaps throughout the day, but overall it sounded like it was Devin Brown taking the snaps with the ones, and he looked really solid throughout the 7-on-7 periods, apparently. Will Howard kind of had an up-and-down day, made some great throws, missed some big-time throws, but overall I think there's going to be a battle down to the first week, and I think Ryan Day is not necessarily loving that prospect, but I frankly think Will Howard is going to take over that job and make it no doubt going into the season, but there's still questions out there, so maybe I'm getting a little bit nervous as well, but it does sound like this wide receiver room is what we expected, one of the elite in the country, but the two guys in that picture are not necessarily the guys that we've been talking about. We've been talking about Emeka Egbuka, Jeremiah Smith, but Carnell Tate apparently made the play of the day yesterday on a slightly highly thrown ball from Will Howard, made a remarkable play on that, and then Brandon Inniss has apparently made a ton of plays early on in camp, so they're doing exactly what you wanted to do. So I definitely think this wide receiver group is about 4 or 5, maybe even 6 deep that absolutely can make some big-time plays, and those two guys might just be the key to this offense, honestly. And then you look at the defensive side of the ball, they're totally dominant. Apparently Jack Sawyer is having an incredible start to camp, and frankly he's going to be incredible this entire year. Sonny Styles is making his jump down to linebacker. That will be a huge thing to watch throughout the camp. And then that guy in the picture, Caleb Downs, he is returning punts. This will obviously be something very interesting to watch. A very, very athletically just freak. There's no two ways about that, but I do think it's one of those things that if he does well returning punts, I would not be surprised seeing him at running back at some point this upcoming year. So it's going to be really fun to watch fall camp unfold. It's always that time of year when these teams really take shape. You know, you get to hear all of the hype going into the season, but now you get to really put pads on and figure out, who's about it, who's not, and it's going to be really fun to watch all of those unfold throughout the next 3 weeks, 4 weeks into the season, and it's going to be remarkable how much this next couple of weeks has to do with what they can do this upcoming season. But let's take our last break here, and when we come back, we're going to do a little bit of a Friday wrap-up, do some headline catch-up with all of the different things that have happened around the sport, so we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the updates from the fall camps around the country. So many different things to watch throughout this month, and we absolutely will keep you updated on everything that you need to know. But let's get into this Friday wrap-up. Let's get some of the headlines around college football and get you updated on everything that you need to know as we head into this season. But let's start over at TCU, where they added a couple of new coaches to that staff, and Sonny Dykes absolutely needed a little bit of help getting everything together for that season with a ton of ability on that team, but not necessarily the I's dotted and the T's crossed the way that you want them to. I think they added 2 really, really talented guys to their coaching staff, starting with Dana Holgorsen. He has coached so much Big 12 football. He has been at West Virginia. He has been at Oklahoma State as a offensive coordinator. He has been at Houston as a head coach. He has done just about everything in the world of college football that you could ask of him, and is a fantastic offensive mind. So someone for Sonny Dykes to kind of bounce ideas off of, kind of work off of a little bit, and absolutely will be a huge asset to him going forward. And then they added Todd Graham, a really talented head coach that is a little bit more on the defensive side of the ball. So added guys on both sides of the ball here, and I think Todd Graham is one of those guys that hasn't necessarily had the fantastic head coaching career that I think a lot of us expected of him, but is absolutely someone that is going to be a huge asset to this team. And it doesn't stop there. They added Andy Avalos as the defensive coordinator, a former head coach at Boise State. They added Ken Wilson as linebackers coach, a former head coach at Nevada. So absolutely will be huge assets for them. And on the defensive side of the ball in particular, they were 103rd last year. They got to get that in order, and Todd Graham will absolutely be someone that can help that. And I think TCU just did a couple of things here that gives them a better shot to win the Big 12. It doesn't necessarily change too much about what I think about this team, but when you unlock what Dana Holgorsen can do and what Sonny Dykes can do on offense, things get pretty interesting pretty quickly. But the other thing I want to get into here is media polls are out for every single conference around the country, and let's just break them down really quick so you get an idea of what the media around that conference is thinking going into the season. Florida State is leading the way in the ACC, 81 first-place votes for them. Clemson not too far behind with 55 first-place votes. Then you have Miami with 17, NC State with 8. Louisville didn't get any, but they are in the 5 position here. They are in the 5 position here. Then you have Virginia Tech at 6. They got 5 first-place votes. Georgia Tech got a first-place vote, which is very interesting. Cal got 2, and Boston College got 1, so not exactly sure what was going on down at the bottom there, but overall will be a very interesting conference, and you see how spread out they are with the first place votes. There's definitely some different teams that can make a run at this conference this upcoming year. And then in the Big 12, you have a ton of different things to watch this upcoming year, but right now it's Utah leading the way. Just by a little bit, though, not necessarily too far ahead of Kansas State. I believe Utah got 20 first-place votes, while Kansas State got 19. So everyone is definitely riding those two bandwagons quite a bit, as am I with Kansas State. But Oklahoma State is right there, up there at the top. I believe they got 14 first-place votes, so not too far from there. And then you have a second tier with Kansas and Arizona. Both got first-place votes with a couple there, but absolutely will be teams that will have plenty to say. And then you have a mess at the bottom. There are so many different teams that are going to be able to make some noise in this conference, and it's going to be really interesting to see how it all shakes out this upcoming year. Then in the Big Ten, you have Ohio State and Oregon getting all of the first-place votes. There was no one else that got a first-place vote. Ohio State got 21 of the 27 first-place votes that were given out. And then Penn State, Michigan, and Iowa sit at the 3, 4, 5. And then you have USC, Wisconsin, and Nebraska right after them. So exactly kind of the way that we expect it to shake out. I'm betting a little bit more on USC and Nebraska than the poll is here. But overall, definitely a very fun conference. And when you look at it, there's really 2 teams at the top that you feel really confident in going into this year, and those are the ones that got the first place votes this time around. Then you got the SEC. This one was totally dominated by Georgia, 165 first-place votes. Texas came in second at 27. So there's quite a big gap, at least according to some of the media people around this conference, and it's a really, really good Georgia team, so I can't necessarily argue with them too much. Bama got 12 first-place votes. Ole Miss right behind them with 4. LSU got 2. And then Vandy somehow got 2. They've gotten a couple throughout the last couple of years, and I don't know who's doing it, but they're lying in some way or the other. And then South Carolina got 1 somehow as well. So a lot of first-place votes to go around, and with that, there's going to be a couple that I just totally don't understand. But UGA definitely setting the pace in that conference with Texas, Alabama, and Ole Miss not too far behind there. But let's move on to Clemson, and let's talk about Ben Boulware. He is joining this staff, and this is a very legendary player in Clemson football history. He won the Jack Lambert Award for the top linebacker back in 2016, and definitely a very talented kid. They won their first national title with him at the helm on that defensive side of the ball for the first time since 1981. He was the co-defensive player of the year that year and logged 131 tackles. That is absolutely insane, truly insane, and absolutely will be a guy that is going to be a really good asset for this team. He finished his Clemson career with 352 tackles, 26 tackles for loss, 10 forced fumbles, 5 interceptions in 31 starts. He made so many plays for this team throughout that incredible run in Clemson's history, and bringing this guy onto the staff is the biggest layup decision you've ever made as Dabo Swinney. This guy apparently reached out to Dabo, said he really wants to be a part of the coaching staff, and you absolutely will take him, especially as something like an intern where you don't really have to pay him too much, and he can absolutely help out with those linebackers. And frankly, I'm really excited to see what he can do with Sammy Brown. That's a very talented freshman that will learn a ton from this guy right here, and might just be that next classic Clemson linebacker that we look back on. But a huge decision for Clemson, and absolutely the right one to bring in a guy like this. Thomas was dismissed from the UGA team yesterday. This is something that I think a lot of us expected after he was, suspended from the team while the investigation went on. Kirby Smart was likely never going to bring him back, and officially had a conversation with him, sat down with him, and told him he would not be returning to the team. This is the second arrest that Thomas has had in the last 18 months, and the first one was not too pretty either. So I do think this is something that was bound to happen. Last year he appeared in 11 games for Georgia, had 23 catches, 383 yards, and a touchdown, which I'm showing you actually in that picture right there. But overall, this is a step in the right direction. UGA has a problem on their hands. I don't think anyone's arguing against that, and they have some things they have to figure out over there. This is the second player that Kirby Smart has dismissed throughout this offseason, joining Daniel David Sensenvaugh, who was going to be a player on this team as well. So two guys that were going to be rotational at the very least for Georgia are now off the team, and they'll have to figure out how to deal with that on the football side of things. But they got plenty of other things on non-football side of things that they have to figure out as well, and Kirby Smart took a step in the right direction to figuring that stuff out yesterday. So obviously something that I think a lot of us expected, but it is official now. Thomas is officially off the UGA football team. And then you have Mel Tucker, the former head coach of Michigan State, is filing a wrongful termination suit against the university, seeking an unspecified monetary compensation for getting fired amid a harassment scandal back in 2023. This is a 75-page suit, so obviously we'll not get too far into the weeds, but he's claiming that Michigan State improperly weaponizing the university's investigative procedures against the plaintiff. So I guess essentially, doing things that are not necessarily the way that they usually go about business. That's the way that they did with Mel Tucker. At least that's what he's claiming. And this is not a new thing in college football. Wrongful termination lawsuits happen pretty much every time. Not every time. They happen quite a bit in this sport. So this is not something that is going to be, huge news by any means as it unfolds, because it's happened quite a bit. Now, Tucker had nearly $80 million left in his contract when he left the job, so he has a little bit of an argument here that a lot of money was lost out on. Now, there's an argument on the other side, obviously, so it's definitely going to be an interesting thing to watch. He was placed on administrative leave back in 2023, and he left the team shortly after that, so it'll be really interesting to see this unfold. I tend to think this will be one that probably goes a little bit more in Michigan State's favor, but overall, if you're Michigan State and you can just pay a little bit of money and frankly get this guy off your books, I think you probably take the opportunity. So it'll be a really interesting thing to watch, and one of those things that absolutely will have an impact on this team going forward and this university overall. So it'll be an interesting thing to watch overall, and definitely something that we will unpack as it does. But a ton of things happening around the sport. Javian Toviano was just reinstated to the LSU team among a interesting legal battle that he's under right now, so that's going to be something to watch throughout the next little bit. There are a ton of things happening around the sport, as you can imagine, as we get a little bit closer to the season. So many different things to unpack, but definitely some really, really big headlines. TCU adding some big head coaches that they very much needed on that staff. The media polls are always a really fun way to kind of look at what's going on in the season, as the people that are closest to that conference, as they see it, is always a very interesting way to kind of look at things. Then Ben Boulware adding to the Clemson staff. That's just a really fun story in my opinion. I think adding him back to that Dabo Swinney staff is a very, very fun thing, and absolutely someone that will be a huge asset for those linebackers. Thomas getting dismissed from UGA, frankly, was just bound to happen at some point, I think. I don't think there was a question that he had probably played his last snap at UGA, and it was a matter of time before Kirby Smart made that decision. And then Mel Tucker doing something that a lot of coaches do, which is wrongful termination suits, and that'll be a very interesting thing to watch as it unfolds. But that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Thank you so much for listening. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does mean the world to us. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for all of the content and updates you could possibly need. We have really incredible people doing really awesome work across every single sport you could want. So whether it's wrestling or baseball or basketball or football that you're after, we have plenty of people over here that can give you everything you need. So come on over to GSMC and we have you totally covered. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.